Hi, everybody. Welcome to the 2024-25 budget briefing. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Seward. I'm the Deputy CEO of WACOSS and I'll be your facilitator for today. As we start, I would like to ask you to join me in acknowledging that we're on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja and also acknowledging the lands that some of you may also be on, acknowledging the elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge that this land was never ceded, that we are on stolen land and that we have a lot of unfinished business. And I'll take this opportunity to remind people that the week beginning the 27th of May is Reconciliation Week, and Reconciliation WA has a large number of activities going on that week. So I urge you to go to their website and join in with those activities, and in particular the walk on the 31st of May. I also acknowledge that the 26th of May is Sorry Day, and again there'll be formalities for that, and I urge you to join those services. I'd like to welcome everybody and thanks for joining us. We have literally toiled overnight, and WACOSS has just posted out to you our fact sheet briefings that went out at 1:01. So hopefully you have that in your inbox. We will obviously be hearing about our budget from our speakers. We've got speakers from Treasury, we've got Chris Toomey, and we've got Emma Hull, one of our senior policy officers, to speak to us today. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the sector. When we were doing the fact sheets, for all those we reached out to, I'd really like to thank you for your very rapid and excellent advice when asked. I'd also like to acknowledge past and present WACOSS board members who may be joining us today, and also all of our colleagues from the sector. We have plenty of time for questions at the end, and at the end we'll also be hearing from some of our sector leads. So if you've got questions that we can't answer, I'm going to throw to them for comments. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce, and both Lisa and Michael are no strangers to us, and I'd like to thank them again for coming to speak to the sector. Less than 24 hours after the budget, literally less than 24 hours after the budget was handed down, we have very senior people from Treasury briefing us, and I think that's very commendable, and I thank you very much. So first off, we'll hear from Michael Andrews, and he's the Assistant Under Treasurer Economic, having commenced in this role in 2023. Prior to this, he was the Assistant Under Treasurer Strategic Policy and Evaluation. He's been in Treasury since 2007 and has worked across a number of business units. And then we'll hear from Lisa B, and I have permission to call her Lisa B, just being clear there. And Lisa is the Acting Assistant Under Treasurer of Strategic Policy and Evaluation, having commenced at the beginning of 2024. Lisa and a team oversees which is really important, around 3/4 of all general government spending in WA on critical social human services, including health, mental health, education, training, police and justice, social housing, child protection and disabilities. So be really nice to Lisa. She also leads and oversees the provision of advice on First Nations outcomes and issues. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you. And can I just say that it's always nice to be with our friends. We are a friend of the sector, and we do value the relationship that we've built over the years. Can I just also spinning off what you were saying around acknowledging our First Nations people, and can I pay our respects and our thanks to traditional owners across our lands, and acknowledge our elders, both past, present and emerging. I think there's a slide deck that is going to be loaded up. So just give it a few seconds to load, and we'll jump right into it. So moving on to the first slide, which really just highlights the highlights of government. We'll just move to the next slide if we can. So I won't spend too much time on this. I think the government have for the last probably couple of weeks really sort of highlighted elements of these sort of 6 key pillars that make up the budget that we sent out yesterday. And Lisa will touch on a number of these as we move through the slides. So we'll jump straight into the economic outlook, and I'll tackle this from a consolidated perspective. So and try and sort of show some insights into how it is also impacting on the community services sector. So to kick things off, one of the key sort of areas around measuring our economy is how our domestic economy is faring, and the way we measure that is through state final demand. We're actually going to increase our expectations around our domestic growth for 23-24. That'll be up to 5.25%. That basically means our domestic economy has been growing above average for the last 4 years. And there's sort of 3 key areas that have been driving that. The first is business investment. That's up by 13% in 23-24, which is also driving a fairly significantly strong labour market. The second is government's investment, not only in the capital side of things and infrastructure, but also there is also a significant investment in both health, housing and education that's also driving this domestic growth. The third one, and quite surprisingly really, is household consumption. The fact that household consumption has held up in Western Australia and it's been as resilient as it has been, particularly with the impact of interest rates and the cost of living, is quite remarkable. But one thing I will point out is that what we have seen in household consumption is a significant shift away from non-discretionary spend, and the vast majority of household expenditure is on those non-discretionary elements. And I guess that doesn't come as much of a surprise given the impacts of cost of living that we're faced with. Moving on to the next slide, and I won't spend too much time on this, but we are essentially in a pretty hot labour market. I don't think that the community services sector is any different. Being able to actually find people to employ is tricky, and then being able to hold on to them is, I guess, a problem in itself. But the essence of growth has come from two elements. We've got a significant population growth over the last 12 months, but also, as I mentioned in the slide before, our business investment, which is a real key driver of economic growth, has been so significant that unemployment rates have been at and remain at historical lows. To put that into perspective, we're sort of sitting at 3.4% in terms of unemployment rates. The sort of long-term average is 6%. So it is at historical lows. We do expect that will moderate and get back to more of that sort of 4.5 to 5% as we get back to sort of normal levels. The next one, it's sort of a good sort of flow into what was driving and is driving our labour market is population growth. Over the last 12 months, we've seen population grow by 94,000 people. To put that into perspective, Victoria released their budget on Tuesday. They had growth of 84,000 people, and they're an economy that's I guess fourfold of what we are. So it just highlights how many people have come into the state over the course of the last 12 months. And it's fair to say that not only has by the sort of the strong labour market, but it's also put pressure on frontline services, which Lisa will touch on. Also, to put that into a little bit more context, that 94,000 people that we've seen come into the state over the course of the last 12 months, 67,000 are from overseas. Our long run average for for overseas migration is about 30,000. So that's more than double than what we're used to receiving on an annual basis. And interstate migration as well has been really significant with essentially the job opportunities that exist in WA. We've seen 11,000 interstate migrants come in over the course of the last 12 months, where on a long run average, it's usually around about 2,000. So you can see just by those sorts of comparisons, the rapid growth that we've received in terms of population growth. Lisa will also touch on this, but this clearly puts a significant pressure on our housing crisis, which we continue to try and address. Moving on to the next slide, inflation. So inflation has come off significantly when we were looking at sort of that 8% back in 2022. We're looking at a CPI of 3.4 in the March quarter. It's fair to say that there's still probably three areas that I'm still coming to terms with the words that economists use, but they refer to it as sticky, and that's essentially meaning that they're not coming down anytime soon. And those three areas are housing, both new and established dwellings. The cost of those two elements are definitely on the up. The second is rent, and that would be no surprise. That is also at significant high levels. And the third one's insurance and insurance premiums. They too are putting significant pressure on the consumer price and inflation. For us, we'll be watching the RBA with great interest over the course of the next 6 months to see what they do and how they sort of address CPI, and given that the impacts of interest rate rises have on households. Moving on to the next slide. So I'll just quickly touch on the state finances, and I don't need to sell this. This is really just sort of a factual representation of what the numbers tell us. So we are in an operating surplus for this budget and for the remaining 4 out years. It's fair to say that those surpluses, whilst they look good on the surface, are essentially being used to fund government's very, very significant capital works program, which totals $42.4 billion over the forward estimates. So that's essentially the implications for our current sort of operating surplus. I then move on to net debt, and this is a new slide. You wouldn't have got this yesterday, but this is just a reflection of what our debt profile looks like over the course of the forward estimates. And as you can see, it is going up. And that's primarily for 2 reasons. The first is sort of what I touched on before. We do have operating surpluses, and those operating surpluses are being used to fund government's significant capital spend, but it's not enough. So we're having to borrow over the course of the forward estimates, and for that reason alone, you're seeing our net debt rise over the forward estimates. The other element, and it's the way that we budget, is conservative revenue forecasts. The key revenue element in our budget is iron ore royalties, and in the out years we do have a conservative target of what we receive for iron ore royalties. So there is an element of upside. So there is the likelihood that they may come down in terms of the impact on our net debt. So that is the finances and sort of the economic position in a real summarised way. I know that the general consensus is that our economy is strong, and it is. And when you compare it to both other jurisdictions, both domestically and abroad, we are lucky in the sense that we do have a strong revenue source. It's really comes down to how government make the decision on how they spend that revenue. So Lisa's going to quickly just familiarise everyone online the authorising environment, and it really sort of then feeds into how we land where we land when it comes to the handing down of the budget. So I'll pass over to Lisa.
Thanks, Mike. I think some of you might be familiar with the slide that we'll talk through on the authorising environment. I think we had a webinar with finance a couple of weeks ago where we were giving an update on the state commissioning strategy and the financial guidelines that Treasury had published just in the last 2 months, I think. And we also provided a couple of slides on the authorising environment and thought it would be a really good opportunity just to reiterate, given we're the day after budget, where the budget sits in that authorising environment in real time. So if you're able to bring that slide up. Yeah, like I said, this might be familiar to, I think Mike and Kate also gave this presentation on the authorising environment towards the end of last year. The slide that we have up here just describes essentially the process that we've gone through over the last 5 months to compile the budget and to bring it down. The budget process starts really around October, November last year, where we have the initiation of budget submissions, of ideas, of priorities of government that agencies start to work on and to discuss with their ministers. They build the business cases, they build the cost plans that they want to put into the budget for consideration by ERC and by government. And then they lodge those submissions at the beginning of the year. That would have been January this year, 5 months ago. And then we go through a period of deliberation through ERC. I think we've highlighted in the past that process of deciding the priorities of the budget does come down to ERC and Cabinet as the executive in our system of decision making. They obviously need to balance competing priorities and the state of the economy and the state's finances and where they put those resources for any given budget. Treasury does have a role in that. We have a role in advising ERC on those bids that ministers and agencies put forward, and ERC takes into account our analysis that we put over those submissions. But Treasury doesn't have any decision-making power in that process. We don't have any delegation or anything like that, but we do have the ability to provide advice and where needed, influence the government's decision-making. So that ERC consideration wrapped up in April this year, and we've spent the last month and a half writing up the budget, which was handed down yesterday by the Minister and read into Parliament at 2 p.m. So really what happens from here is those budget papers now need to go through to Parliament to be endorsed by the people's representatives, and we'll have estimates hearings starting in, I think, 2 weeks' time, where agencies and ministers will be going before Parliament and being scrutinised on their expenditure that they're basically seeking approval for the year coming. I think the comment that we've got up the top there, that timing is important. There's a short window between budget decision-making cycles. The cycle that we're about to head into basically from today, starting the next budget cycle, because it is a never-ending cycle and it is relentless, will be impacted by the election this year. So our state election will be in March next year. So that will delay this process. We won't have a budget that's really considered and handed down till most likely August, September next year. So that process that we've described through the authorising environment will obviously be impacted by that election process. I think that's it for that slide. So I'm going to turn to now to talk to some of the key initiatives that are in the budget that was handed down yesterday. I'll just briefly touch on, Mike mentioned that population was one of the key themes in this budget, and the number of people moving to Western Australia is definitely something that's impacting on our services and where resourcing needs to go for those departments to make sure that the services can meet that higher population growth and the demand. That was really felt quite strongly in the health system. There was $3.2 billion worth of funding that needed to be put to the health system to basically respond to additional beds that the government's bringing online, and the additional workforce that's needed for that. So nurses and doctors to keep the system going. That includes in the WA Country Health Network as well, to keep health services operating in the regions, and also initiatives around making sure that we have good patient flow, that we address the needs of vulnerable people who find themselves in the health system, but who, you know, potentially could be helped better outside of the health system with housing and disability support services and the like. Education was another key investment, 1.3 billion on education and training to respond essentially to increases in enrolments and the services that are needed there. But one of the key themes that the Treasurer and the Premier spoke to yesterday in the budget was supporting WA households through cost of living relief. It was a $762 million cost of living package. And the two key components of that were the continuation of the $400 electricity credit that was first introduced, I think, in 2020. And that's continued for the last few years, including this year. And the WA Student Assistance Payment, which was a new initiative that provides $250 for each child in high school and $150 for children in primary school to all Western Australian families. There were a number of other initiatives that were largely around fee relief and building on the social concessions that government hands down in its budget every year, which total, just for context, around $3 billion per year in a bundle of concessions that are outlined in the budget papers. I think I'll leave that one there. Moving more to initiatives that might be of particular interest to the people online. Housing was another big theme in this budget. The Treasurer did get a number of questions in the lockups yesterday and subsequently from the media around where will the people who are moving to Western Australia live, and housing is obviously a very key priority of the government. This year we have another quite significant material investment in housing, $1.1 billion. And that's really underpinned by a further top up of the Social Housing Investment Fund, which was first initiated in 2021. We've now had 1.6 billion invested into that fund. And that investment is really underpinning an expansion in the social housing network to almost 5,000 social houses. Also some refurbishments to make sure that the stock that we have can be retained and that people can live in them. And grants to community housing providers, which has also been a focus of the Social Housing Investment Fund, so that we can partner with CHPs to get houses built and to build their stock levels. Also on the housing front, almost 180 million for maintenance of the state's existing housing stock, almost 45,000 houses there. An interesting component of that you might have picked up, there was an initiative called the SHEPI, which I think is the Social Housing Electricity Provision Initiative. So this is an initiative that's actually come from the Commonwealth Government, which is geared around making social houses more energy efficient so that it reduces the running costs and basically contributes to the usability and utility of those houses. The government's committed $25 million towards that. It's just a trial at this point in time, and we're hoping that we can get some Commonwealth partnership funding towards that. I guess the other key thing to note here is that the Social Housing Investment Fund has been broadened to include affordable housing for the first time since it was first initiated in 2021, with a recognition by government the diversity of housing choices and the need to focus on, as well as the priority social housing area, housing that is affordable for people to live in is also a priority here. And the government's looking to how we can make best use of the Housing Australia Future Fund announcement by the Commonwealth, where they're looking to facilitate partnerships with CHPs, developers and governments to get more housing stock underway out of that fund. Mike's area in the Housing Support Unit in Treasury is really integral to that, and we'll be working to make sure that we get the best value out of that initiative by the Commonwealth. you want to add anything to that, Mike?
No, well, I guess it's probably fair to say that we're working very closely with Housing Australia in regards to their sort of their first iteration of the allocation of funding for the Housing Australia Future Fund. So we're hoping to hear from the Commonwealth in June or July this year as to where that first allocation will be. Yeah, we'll make sure that we'll keep you abreast of movements as it comes to hand. But yeah, working really hard with our partners to try and secure as much money as we possibly can from the Commonwealth out of that fund.
I guess the only other thing I'd add on housing is that there's been an acknowledgement that while 5,000 social houses have been committed, 2,100 have been developed, which is really good work by the Department of Communities, but there are obviously significant challenges, as I'm sure everyone's aware, in delivering housing in regional Western Australia. So some of the initiatives that are in this budget are geared around trying to expand the diversity of how we're looking to deliver housing so that we can address some of those challenges. Moving on to stronger communities. So I'm sure some of these package numbers would be familiar to you, but in the community space, the government has announced over the last week or so a $96 million package for FDV initiatives. Part of that was really geared around the Family and Domestic Violence Task Force reform plan that was handed down and endorsed by the task force and by government and released publicly in the last couple of weeks. 88 million for child protection initiatives. Just some of the initiatives in that space are expanding the home stretch program, which is around the supports for kids as they age out of state care. Also support for carers in the out of home care system so that we can assist them in the important work that they do, and enhancing and upgrading some of the houses that are used in the out of home care spaces well to make sure that those houses are fit for purpose. In the homelessness space, which we don't have up on the screen, there was a significant investment by government of 92 million, and that was underpinned in part by an uplift in funding for those homelessness services ahead of recommissioning. And lastly, I'll just mention the $70 million for the government's cleaner reforms around people with mental impairment in the court system, which was brought to book in this budget. Just probably leading on from that, in terms of support for the non-government community services sector, in this budget, there was an uplift to the indexation. That's really around the parameters of CPI and WPI under the indexation method that we use, $44.3 million. The 2024-25 rate will be known, I suppose, shortly. So in June, we should get the confirmation of the WPI amount that will go into that calculation. And at that point, I imagine that there'll be an announcement on what the 24-25 rate is. We're also expecting that the Fair Work order that will come down in mid-June is something that the government will be looking at in terms of the indexation for the year ahead. And I guess just making the point that some of the services that have been announced in this budget, which are new services or which are expansions of existing services or additional funding for continuation of existing services, quite a bit of that funding does go through to community services providers. In terms of the scale and scope of services provided by the sector, back in 2021, it was forecast that about $1.2 billion was being spent on services delivered by the sector. And in this budget, we estimate that that's growing to 1.7 billion. So I think that just gives context to the scope and the breadth of services that are delivered by the sector and the materiality of that in our budget. I think I'm being pressed for time, but just on Aboriginal wellbeing initiatives in this budget, there's a number of initiatives that have been announced by the government, partly focused on therapeutic approaches in the children's court. And I remember when we were here last year, there was quite a big discussion on the children's court in Western Australia and the programs for young kids in that are coming through that court system. a continuation of the Aboriginal Social and Emotional Wellbeing Program, $6 million for Aboriginal representative organisations and Aboriginal family-led decision-making, which are two initiatives that have been trialled over the last couple of years and will be expanded and extended. If you were looking through budget paper 3, one thing that we've done is tried to note where there are these investments that have been made, how they do factor into the closing the gap targets as well, so that's noted. So I think in summary, those are the main initiatives that we thought you'd like to talk about. The government's made a big focus, obviously, on the cost of living support that's been provided in this budget, housing, also the key services that have had to be expanded through the population growth we're seeing. And yeah, I think that's largely it.
Thank you very
Moving
much.
forward, sorry.
No, according to me, you're on time.
Okay.
Thank you very
Take
much.
questions afterwards, I
Yeah,
assume.
yeah, that's okay. I'd now like to move on to our speakers from WACOSS and introduce them. First off, we'll hear from Chris Toomey, who's the leader of policy and research, to provide us with an overview. And then we'll hear from Emily Hull, who's one of our senior policy officers, and she will provide us with a gender lens. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Kaya, Nalakadich, Whadjuk Noongar Boodja, Kain Kadik, Ichibucha. I'm just going to run through and kind of pick up a couple of the kind of key issues and messages that have emerged for us. We've already heard, you know, a bit from Mike and Lisa about the way the budget was framed. It was particularly put forward as providing record cost of living relief for WA families. It's also balanced between, you'd say, the pillars of the strength of our resources sector, the challenges of population growth, and then the ongoing impacts of inflation and skill shortages. They're the kind of 3 big things that are churning on in the balance. The key question for us as a sector was really around the cost of living package. To what extent is it really kind of, you know, an effective response? What's the balance between broader population measures versus things that are actually targeted to those who are really struggling? And Mike highlighted earlier how large that population increase has been, and that's quite dramatic. And it also highlights a critical issue for us as a sector, in that our funding models aren't necessarily framed around how is funding over time, how is the level of services responding to changing population size. We tend to have kind of a set figure that's indexed a bit, but tends to fall behind the level of demand over time, and also often falls behind the real costs of delivering services, particularly award wages.
Mm-hmm.
So these were the 5 key pillars that the Premier highlighted in his speech as well: cost of living, housing, health, infrastructure and economic growth. And then you also saw, like in the key figures that they highlighted, they've also picked up education and training there as framed around the discussion on job creation. Now, I wanted to just talk for a little bit about the cost of living package. Sorry, just give me a sec. Sorry, the screen's appearing in front of my notes. So as I mentioned earlier, the key challenge for us is that the package is mostly made up of broad whole of population measures. And it was interesting going through the Treasurer's speech. She mentions cost of living 10 or 12 times, but it's always about all families or working families or all households. And so, you know, we've got the electricity credits, which are going on again. We've got the student assistance payments, again, which aren't targeted, although there is a secondary assistance scheme that also sits there that was already existing, which is very much targeted to children in families who've got existing concessions. And similarly then, when we also saw with some of the mentions around the seniors card and so on, in all of these areas, they kind of had some opportunities where there were some existing concession frameworks. There is a strong argument for having some broad-based measures, particularly broad-based measures for families, because we know there's a lot of families out there who may be on one or two incomes sitting in the middle of the distribution who are still struggling. But really kind of when it comes to cost of living assistance, we feel it could have been more efficient and more effective and probably less inflationary if there was more stuff that was being targeted to those who are really in financial hardship, particularly because we also know that being able to get in quick and early with assistance for people when they're really struggling can make a long difference to how long it takes them to get back on their feet. And particularly as well, when they've got kind of kids growing up in poverty, it has a really strong impact. The next one I was going to jump onto quickly was just kind of reflecting on this wages versus prices analysis that was sitting in the budget and kind of stuck them roughly together here.
Yep.
And what that gives you is an idea of the size of the volume between those two. And that's effectively how you've got to get that much space again, sort of above the line for wage growth before average households kind of spending power catches up to what it was and they can get back to the standard of living that they have. And so for those on low and fixed incomes, when you see CPI going up like that, you know that particularly when you've got rising essential costs and particularly rising rents, that this means that there are some people that are really struggling. And this was a little bit of modelling that my colleague, Professor Alan Duncan from BCEC did. And kind of based on his numbers, he was saying if wages continued to rise at 1% per annum, then it would take until around 2028 until we're actually catching up to where we were, kind of previous to the current dip. Although noting that the projection over forward estimates actually has them tailing off before then. So I suppose it just kind of highlights the challenge there a bit. I did really want to highlight a couple of things around the housing and homeless package. You have to say that overall this is a really good package. It's it's been designed thoughtfully and there's been good engagement with the sector. It's not perfect and there's a pile of things that it's difficult for the state government to do anyway when we're in a situation where we've got population growth, we've got skill shortages, we've got blockages in the supply chain that makes construction really hard, which also throws up a bit of a question about the level of the investment in infrastructure that they've got going forward, because that's going to be competing with their ability to build new houses. And to my mind, that and those population figures are the real critical challenge. That means that housing is not going to go away as an issue anytime soon, and particularly for people on low income rentals. And from the evidence that we've seen, those in lower quartile rentals, their prices have gone up faster than anyone else. They tend to be in those older, poorer quality properties that are out on the urban fringe. They tend to be more energy inefficient. And there's a risk that they're unhealthy as well. And you've got, the kids dealing with black mold and things like that. So there is this measure here, $85 million to boost the construction workforce. It's interesting. We also did some analysis looking at the movements in the construction workforce over the last 4 or 5 years. And we've seen people move into the construction workforce from other areas and then move largely to mining. So we've still got that challenge.
Yep.
And particularly when a lot of our infrastructure investment is getting ready for other big industries to develop, that's still going to be an ongoing pressure into the future. But so the one other thing I wanted to highlight in the housing stuff is the thing that's been kind of really promising. And I think as a sector, we need to be commending Minister Carey for the way he's engaged with the sector and the way he's actually looked at focusing on uplifting and boosting the capacity of existing homeless services to deliver more services and address that unmet need. So there's been that funding uplift there. And it's also something that's quite smart when we're in a situation where if he's announcing new services and programs, they'll struggle to get established, they'll struggle to find new staff. But we do know we've got a lot of existing staff in the sector whose hours have been reduced over the last few years. So there's great kind of opportunity there. And and the regional housing stuff is also kind of really important and critical there. You highlighted the stuff around population, and there's the employment stuff as well. I suppose that the one thing to note on that is often when we're talking about jobs growth, we talk about the number of jobs. There's actually a thing about what's the rate of the number of jobs that we actually need to be creating when our population's growing that fast. So obviously there's kind of still going to be that challenge. The forward projections for employment still look really good, but they're coming down off the highs that we've got. But what this does mean for the sector is we've still got these incredible challenges when it comes to workforce recruitment and retention. And then particularly that's doubled up when you're talking in the regions, when being able to recruit someone means that they've got to be able to find a rental property they can afford in town. They've got to be able to find a childcare they can get their child into. And those two things we've heard from our consultations with the sector are huge challenges. So the unemployment participation rate figures, are really great, really promising, but we've still got those kind of underlying challenges going on there. Just quickly highlighting for you, these are some of the fact sheets that we've pulled together, and suggest you go and have a kind of good dig through them. And we've provided all of the links in there, both of the media releases and where you can find the details in the budget papers to pull them apart a bit more. The next area was health, and I'm just going to kind of skim over this one quickly. Large numbers, but also it's responding to population growth, and it's responding to some of those kind of challenges where we've been trying to catch up with, EDs, ambulance ramping, those sort of challenges. I suppose from a sector point of view, the investment is mostly still at the acute end. It's in hospital beds. The regional investments, Aboriginal investments are really critical. The stuff around child development services has also been a big priority for the sector. That's something that's really important. Again, there's a bit of a catch up there. There's also a question of the extent to which that's actually going to solve some of the problems that we're seeing. The focus there is mostly kind of going out through the existing, child and adolescent health service, WA Country Health Services, boosting their capacity. The challenges that we've had in practice have been first a rely on having to get a diagnosis before you can get into service, and then a long wait list for both of those. So we think this is amazing. We think looking forward, it would be good to look what are the opportunities to be working with frontline children and family services to do some of that early identification of risk, to have ways we can get advice to families earlier so that they can start dealing with this. Because we know in the early development, those years are critical. The time goes really fast, and we're increasingly having problems with kids starting school who are behind. When they start behind, they fall behind further. So really important area, but also some kind of critical challenges there going forward. Mike's already run, something's gone wrong with the way my slides come here. And anyway, Mike ran through a whole pile of these. Short story is the economy there is looking really strong. And sorry, that front one stuck over the top. Also the comparison of how WA is doing compared to the other states on debt as well is kind of a really positive one. And particularly then when you look at the strength of WA and Australia and compared to how other countries are doing around the world, we are in a really strong position, but it also means we've got the capacity to do things with that. And I always have to throw in the cartoon. This was the only one we got this time around.
I hadn't seen it yet, so
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah, it's sort of entertaining. I didn't think Roger looked anything like that tired yesterday. He was actually pretty chipper. So, the MetroNet, they're making a bit about the cost blowouts there, and it's true. It's not that great compared to the scale of the thing, you'd have to say. But it's also, when we're talking about a growing state, it's the kind of long-term infrastructure that's kind of really critical to social functioning, people to able to get around for jobs and services and so on. So there you go. But so you talked about those numbers and that kind of bottom line of the 42.4 billion invested into infrastructure. It's a very large number, and it's a very large number at a time when we're really struggling with the construction workforce and the supply of housing. So that's a big challenge. And that's just kind of a bit of a breakdown of where the spending is. The utility stuff there is also really important because that's linked into the decarbonisation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also addressing some of those really kind of critical climate issues around water supply, which again are terrible. WA's had the worst internationally decrease in rainfall of anywhere in runoff. So that's really important.
So Chris, can I just add to particularly utilities? We're not only in competition with the domestic market, we're also in competition with the international. Everybody is moving towards that decarbonisation. So that is going to be a very long journey, and dare I say, a very expensive journey as well. Not just for the state and Commonwealth governments, but also for industry and big business. So
and that kind of also then includes a pile of the investment that was kind of going into the regions. Oh, there we go. I was about to say the decarbonisation stuff. One of the other comment about, so the economic diversification stuff's really important as well. And that's important in kind of smoothing out our economic cycle. And so we don't have the resource boom and bust stuff going on. What is interesting there, you know, I mentioned the focus on infrastructure. The other thing there is a lot of that new infrastructure there is sort of some transitional stuff around getting us ready for more big industries. And so some of that is then converting and using more of our minerals onshore. A pole that's just also kind of getting ready to do more of the same, I suppose. But the other comment that I'd have to throw in on the decarbonisation one is that putting that investment is really important and really laudable. But when you actually look at what we're doing with LPG developments of, you know, Scarborough and the Northwest Shelf, we're actually blowing the Australian carbon budget out of the water. So there's a bit of a balancing act there. The decarbonisation has to happen, but if we're going to keep it, you know, approving gas projects the way that we are, we're kind of going backwards in a sense there as well. So just kind of finally, just kind of highlighting on a few of the kind of key announcements. I must admit, I was a little bit disappointed of the images they chose to put next to this area where we had kind of the investment into communities to kind of frame it into an election, you know, tough on crime sort of picture. And let me just kind of jump onto, oops, no, sorry. I wanted to make a couple of kind of quick comments as well when it came to the stuff around children and families. I mentioned the kind of early child development stuff. Otherwise, we've got a pile of investment there that is mostly at the pointy end with critical stuff that we need to do around crisis services and family and domestic violence. Child protection's got a bit of a mix, and certainly the home stretch stuff is really important, and we're really glad to see that being extended and made into an ongoing program, and particularly being extended so that there's now, I think, 9 ACOs they're bringing on board into that. That's been a really kind of critical transition program from, as a state, we have been one of the last to get to that point where kids would turn 18, young people would turn 18 and we'd say, okay, you're on your own. And a lot of them would then get into a lot of trouble. So that transition and the support going through to the age of 21 has really been critical. But yes, a lot of that's still kind of very much at the pointy end, and there's less of the prevention, early intervention stuff that we'd really like to see, less of that kind of integrated community-based approach. Just sort of pointing out a few of the kind of key fact sheets that we've got coming through just to encourage people to go and have a look at these. Aboriginal Wellbeing Justice. We've done a women's one, FTV. That's the children and families, so I was mentioning a couple of those. Also some great stuff in the disaster risk and reduction space, resilience. and the emergency management space. There you go, mental health, AOD. I think that's kind of pretty much all I wanted to say. And we should probably just
Thank
move on to the
you.
next bit.
And now we're going to hear from Emily Hull, who's one of our senior policy officers. She's going to come up and sit here. So I'm just going to swap.
Hi, everybody. My name's Emily. Thanks, Rachel and Chris. So for me, coming into this budget, it was absolutely critical for the government to invest in women and in a community where women can thrive. We know that WA women are exposed to a significant gender pay gap. We experience crisis rates of family and domestic violence, and too often we hold too much responsibility for unpaid care work. To me, the rallies in April this year, both in WA and across the country, clearly showed that women are looking to our governments to lead real reform that values women and our social, emotional, and economic contributions. So considering this context, I think it's pretty safe for me to say that the 2024-25 budget fell a bit short for women this time around. While we saw good investment in some areas, such as FDV, there seems to be an overall lack of commitment to systematically addressing barriers to women's economic and social participation. For example, we saw a critical commitment to family and domestic violence response through a $96.4 million investment in initiatives such as the Lived Experience Advisory Group, the FDV Task Force Systems Reform Plan, and behaviour change programs. Yet, in the same budget, we see a lack of appetite to fund specialist sexual assault services, critical refuges and safe houses, or the implementation of the Aboriginal Family Safety Strategy. Similarly, when we look towards women's economic independence, we finally see a $5 million investment in upgrades to career fire and rescue stations, showers and locker rooms. This funding will allow women in these male-dominated workplaces to access private bathrooms and change spaces. Yet in this budget, we don't see investment in ensuring women have pathways to work, are safe at work, have the tools to maintain and navigate work, or are adequately remunerated for their work in feminised industries. A final example of the one step forward, one step back investment approach is the Gender Equality and Procurement Pilot. So this pilot, led by Department of Communities and Department of Finance, is an initiative to embed gender equality principles into selected government procurement. In its current form, the pilot asks business to complete a gender equity clause, which considers a business's compliance with WGEA and if the business has policies to support workplace gender equality. Yet this pilot does not currently collect basic information on the businesses, including the number of female employees or the employer gender pay gap. This lack of information prevents the pilot from making meaningful decisions about who should actually receive money and funding. Money and funding, that's a tricky one. Considering their commitment to equality. I think while this pilot was a really necessary starting point, without really active commitment to a forward-looking approach that uses appropriate metrics and expectations, this program just becomes an expensive exercise in ticking equity boxes. As seen in previous years, the Supporting WA Women Snapshot highlights a whole range of large investments in areas such as housing, mental health, and cost of living. While some of these investments are gender specific, many are not. And many of these initiatives, it's actually really unclear where the main benefit of the investment goes. So a good example of this is WA's continued investment in building or upgrading maternity hospitals. Beside the fact that pregnancy care only constitutes a very small part of a woman's health journey, this funding is for what's on the tin, infrastructure development, not programs, not services, but for building upgrades. So yes, while women and fathers and families will use a maternity hospital, the immediate benefits of this investment are actually a gain for male-dominated areas and workforces, such as the construction industry. So considering this, we wanted to continue to call on the WA government to adopt a gender-responsive budgeting approach, that analyses and transparently reports on the gendered impacts of all public spending, and particularly on the large percentage of spending which sits outside of the supporting WA Women Snapshot. We want to see how our public money is impacting our life outcomes. I think it is really important to acknowledge that gender responsive budgeting work is challenging and will require skill development and investment, but it is work that must happen if we're going to truly create a WA where women can thrive. So in short, while we've seen investment on some of the issues impacting women in WA, this budget was ultimately a missed opportunity to fund a gender responsive budgeting unit within Treasury and truly consider how our social systems, structures and spending contribute to gender inequity and poor outcomes for WA. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emily. Really appreciate your input. Okay, so now it's over to you and question time. So if you could put questions in the chat, and by miracles of modern technology, they will magically then appear on my computer. As I said earlier, we have a couple of people that I've already lined up to make a few comments. So while those questions start rolling in, I can see Kath Snell on the screen, so I'm going to go to Kath first, and then Sandy, I'll go to you, just to give us a little bit of your thoughts of what you think about the budget while we get some questions rolling in. And if you've got a question, feel free to throw it in.
Thanks, Rachel. And well done, WACOSS. I do not know how you managed to get all of that work done in the last 24 hours and so much information out. So absolute hat off to you. I do want to take this opportunity to say thank you to the government and to the representatives of Treasury that we've got there, Mike and Lisa. I think from a homelessness and housing viewpoint, we obviously been over the moon with the announcements. The homelessness sector was in dire need of some support, and this has really taken the pressure off. 92.2 million into homelessness services. So that's been really warmly welcomed across the sector. And the investment into housing, I think everybody knew that had to happen, and we're really glad to see that it has. I'd also agree with Chris at WACOSS to say that there was some areas that I think we've missed, and from our point of view, we'd like to have seen the budget be a bit more ambitious. We're in a major crisis, and I think we would have liked to have seen some major solutions. And I think while the government has said that they will purchase some of the NRAS properties, which is the National Rental Affordability Scheme, which will be coming to an end in the next couple of years, that's really putting people at risk of having even less affordable rental supply in the market. So we were really hoping that the state would look at a state level affordability rental scheme, so that there would be more supply, affordable supply pushed in to the state. So we keep advocating for that because we think that's really important. And the other thing I'll say is really glad to see that cost of living has been addressed. This has been a talking point for a long time, and you don't need me to tell you how much pressure there is on families. You only have to listen to the news or read any of the articles. It's pretty emotional working in the sector, hearing the stories all the time. I'm going to be perfectly honest and say that while a $400 electricity credit is going to be welcomed by a lot of people, I think there are many, many people in WA that don't need that. And we would have preferred to have seen a much more targeted approach to cost of living relief that is focused on the most disadvantaged people in our society. And I'll just say this last thing, we would love to have seen that to be that support in social housing where there was energy efficiencies put in place so people could make those savings over years and years and years. So they could have been, the money that was put into that energy credit could have been put into energy efficiencies in social housing and allowed people to see those greater savings. But I am pleased to see that there's a trial of something similar in the Kimberley with that 25 million. That's great news. And we will make sure we work closely with government on that to see what the results are. And hopefully with some evidence base, we can try and roll that out further across WA. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kath. And Sandy, I can see you there. Do you, Sandy, do you have any comments? You're on mute.
Good afternoon. Apologies, everyone. I'd like to also thank WACOSS for all the work, and I had some of my team in with you, and they were very warmly accepted and part of the team last night, so came back with a great experience. I suppose I reiterate Chris's comments that the budget for young people is at the very pointy end, and when we see some really strong highlights in youth justice and crime, it does make us sort of wonder about some of those primary prevention spaces that aren't being addressed that are resulting in more young people in that at-risk space. But there are some great initiatives, the ongoing support of Homestretch in particular that we know has been important to not only expand the program but to ensure that things like brokerage funds for all young people are continued to be available. The child development services also are welcomed for sort of more resources, but additionally, we know outside the metro area it's even worse than it is in the regions to find access to those services and then get referral without diagnosis. There does need to be some consideration about how that need is going to be met. The Ride to School program, again, in the cost of living, yes, that will work for families where smart riders are already in existence, but for families that are not able to access that, we may result in more young people actually with more fines because they're not able to sort of utilise the system in the way that it's been structured. There's a few barriers. There's quite a lot in the youth justice space for the children's courts work, which I think in those diversionary programs, we need way more of those than what have been funded. And the investments into Banksia and Unit 18 make us believe that this is not an issue that's going away anytime soon. So lastly, I think some significant funding back into the infant, child and adolescent task force work that's been pretty much a bit behind due to shifts and changes in the last couple of years. It's good to see more investment there, but again, very much in the crisis end of work rather than the early intervention and prevention work that we know is absolutely desperately needed for young people. That's my summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, we've now got some questions come in. So I've got one from Kim Brooklyn. There appears to be a lot of investing into the existing investments, which is great, but I can't see many new initiatives that prevent issues before they need the more complex and expensive services. Have I missed something?
Mm-hmm. I think the point's been made really well today by a couple of people about the importance of early intervention services, and Treasury is an advocate of that, because I think Mike and Al have mentioned in the past that we do see it as a way of diverting people from those high cost tertiary services and getting to them when the issues are identified and before they become bigger and bigger issues in society, and for the services that need to be there is really important. It probably isn't strongly focused in the budget in terms of early intervention. It is, I do think that there is a growing awareness of the child development support services and things like that, where getting children early when those issues emerge is something that we need to be focusing on more. And I think from our perspective, we're keen to see how the NDIS reforms play out in terms of foundational supports and how that might impact some of our mainstream services in Western Australia, and how that's going to impact in particular on kids and the services that they're going to need to help them navigate those services.
Okay, I'm gonna
Can I
use,
quickly just jump in
Oh,
on that,
yeah,
because I did work very closely on the ICA reforms, and that being sort of a 10-year glide path in terms of implementing those recommendations. And I can only concur with what you're saying, Sandy. It's definitely an area that will need to be built on. I think the key thing for government in that space, though, is around achievability. Actually getting the resources and having that sustainable resources to build on. And so, whilst it would be great to get more, it's about doing it in a way that we can build on. And hopefully, it's these sorts of discussions that we have on a regular basis that we keep that in the eye of government.
thank you. And I'm actually going to use the facilitators prerogative and ask a supplementary. In terms of NDIS, I've got to say we struggled to sort of identify funding into disability, particularly in light of what we know that's going on with the, with the foundational supports, etc. So can either of you sort of explain a little bit of that for us? Because as I said, we've been able to dig down and get to the crux of it.
And that's fine, because we are also struggling
Right.
with that. But yeah, I'll get Lisa to touch on that. Her, you might want to jump in as well.
I think in terms of initiatives in this budget, it's probably a bit early, because given National Cabinet signed off on these reforms at the end of last year, the discussion is still playing out in terms of what it actually means. Obviously, the legislation has been put into Parliament, been referred to a committee, so that's being worked through. There is the discussion happening from a state's perspective on what it means for Western Australia and what it means for our mainstream services, but probably too early to be seeing initiatives yet in the budget. But the timeframes are tight, so I think we're all scrambling.
Yes, that's what we were worried about,
Yeah, the timeframes are tight, so we're all scrambling to understand what it means.
Yeah, and particularly how it crosses into those mainstream services, particularly health and education.
Yeah, all right. So it looks like we have to pay very close attention to budget next year, where the government will obviously have to be factoring things in. Is that a fair assumption?
Oh, look, I think there's, as Lisa touched on, we are moving at a rate of knots.
Maybe mid-year?
I think there will be movement over the course of 2024.
Okay. Right. Okay. Well, watch this space, folks. I've got a question from Philippa Boldy. Financial hardship and cost of living pressures are strongly in focus this year. Has the budget provided any clarity on future investment in financial counselling? This sector is currently in limbo, waiting for clarity on future commissioning of these crucial services beyond 30 June. Good question.
I could probably jump in on that one.
Yeah.
I think it isn't a strong focus in this budget from what we can see in terms of initiatives or new initiatives expanding financial counselling. There has possibly been more of a focus on initiatives such as the rental assistance scheme and how financial counselling feeds into that in assisting with the support that's provided to people in rentals, and then the support with budgeting around that as well. But I definitely hear you, and I think Pernie was in the industry lockup yesterday and had quite a few discussions on financial counselling and the importance of those services, but no new services in this budget.
Antonella's got a comment rather than a question. I'd like to make a comment from ADHDWA. It welcomes the 39 million to child development services, though not sure how high needs will be met and where clinicians will be found. Disappointed that no funding has been allocated from the 244 million to schools for individualised funding, with no funds allocated to children with ADHD, which will continue to be a strain on their families. We'd like to see government acknowledge all neurodiverse conditions, especially in view of high numbers of children within the high risk space. Did you want to make any comments on that?
So I just took that as a statement.
Well, I should say it's a comment, but it sounded like Lisa might have wanted to make a comment, but.
Oh, I think it was more understanding the statement as well. So I know in the education system, I think I spoke to the investment in the increase in enrolments, that investment also incorporated an increase in funding for kids who do have development needs along the disability spectrum. but it sounds like what's been kind of advised is that that's not picking up on particular needs in the school system.
Antonella, is that the case? Don't want to, or you can put it in chat if you don't want to.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the case. Unfortunately, ADHD does not sit within the 8 disability priorities for individualized funding. And we've been heavily advocating for that change. And, you know, it's really, really disappointing that none of those children will. It's basically for children with autism, which we absolutely welcome. But there's nothing in the space of ADHD, and there's more children in the schools with ADHD. And let's remember that they're not receiving any NDIS support either. So those families are doing it incredibly tough. And we're seeing that high percentage of children then ending up within the justice system. So something that I would hope would be considered. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Antonella. Michael Pugh asks, is it possible to clarify whether the maintenance uplift for social housing extend only to public housing or also community housing, given that much stock with the latter were often ageing stock transferred to CHO's management, and that requires significant investment in order to remain safe, appropriate and fit for purpose at a time when we need to retain as well as expand our overall social housing stock?
I'm fairly sure that it's for housing that's owned and maintained by the Department of Communities. I'm aware that there was a program a couple of years ago that was providing support for refurbishments for maintenance for community housing providers. But that $179 million investment is largely for the 45,000 social houses that are owned by the department.
Okay. I've got a question from Fran. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm skipping over Alex Hughes. I better go in the right order. This is from Alex Hughes. Going forward into the election, are we likely to see less one-off, one-size-fits-all relief programs and more targeted long-term initiatives that drive equitable outcomes for those who need it?
I guess we're at the whim of government in regards to that over the course of the next sort of 6 to 12 months. Yeah, it's hard to answer that. It's,
but that's a point. It's a good point.
That's a good point.
Alex, it's a point that we try to make, or we end up making a lot, because we do need longer term funding. Okay, Francis Lynch, community legal centres are still unclear how we will progress past the current five-year agreement ends June 25. I know we're waiting on the feds to make some decisions, but we need to see action in mid-year or these services become significantly destabilised. And then a supplementary from Chelsea, we'll do them together. Following on from Francis's comment about community legal centres, why was the investment not prioritised in the forward estimates? The CLC sector seems caught in the middle between federal and local governments.
That's what I might need to take on notice in terms of the contract expiring. I am aware that the federal funding agreement is being negotiated to come up later this year, and that might trigger some discussions on the funding that we've got from a state perspective over the forward estimates as well. But yeah, I might need to take that on notice in terms of the timing of that.
Okay. We'll make sure we keep a record as well. And then I've got, I haven't, that was a supplementary from Chelsea, and now I've got another one from Chelsea. It's great to hear that Treasury is an advocate for early intervention. My screen jumped. Community sector has been advocating for this for decades. What are the barriers to this investment across a range of spaces, e.g. justice? Is it just politics?
I think it's also the fact that it's generational change when we're looking at early intervention. That usually goes beyond the cycle of a government. and generally being able to actually show results can be tricky. I did see that Deb asked a question around data. It is critical. It is the ability to actually measure outcomes and be able to synthesize that information into a way that tells a narrative is critical. So getting good data and being able to actually share good data is a real key. So yeah, I guess that the question was whether or not it's political. Yeah, it really comes to being able to actually illustrate the outcomes.
I think there's something as well in the fact that sometimes early intervention, the approaches need to be trialled. And so there's often an investment by government in trials, but then the challenge is in turning those trials. Well, number one, giving those trials enough time to actually develop and collect collect the data that Mike's talking about, but then to actually transfer that into mainstream approaches and more broader scale. That does seem to be one of the challenges as well.
Thank you. Next is Mason. There was no funding in this budget attached to the alternative new facility to Unit 18, and there has been no news since the announcement of a rapid business case development on this. Given the lack of widespread funding to provide relief in youth justice, although funding for in the roads court is highly welcomed, are there any updates on how investment in youth justice is being weighted, with particular thought to how we prevent children entering detention in the first place? We need a considered approach here.
That one's probably a bit of a difficult one for us to answer. As you know, there's not been a decision published on an alternative new facility at this time. But that's one that's probably, in terms of the approaches to youth justice, is probably better directed to the Department of Justice than us in Treasury.
Okay. Deb, was there anything said or committed to digital inclusion link? And you've already touched on the actual data side of it, but anything specific on digital inclusion?
I don't think there was, to be honest with you. No, I don't recall anything that was specific to that. But obviously there's work that.
Does that mean that People WA, that thing, does that just kind of disappear into a black neck sort of hole, or like, is there no sort of strategic investment and direction for
No, definitely
data?
Doesn't disappear into a black hole there. It's obviously it's still there. It does sit with the Office of Digital Government.
Yeah.
But in terms of this budget, there wasn't any sort of allocation of funding in regards to that.
Deb, we have done a fact sheet on some digital stuff because there is some, it's not about digital inclusion per se, but there is some around investment in technology, etc. Deb also had a second question, and that is the significant investment in health is towards the tertiary sector. What is the thinking about the need to, in quotes, rebalance the system? Is that in future years?
My question was really just that the language of rebalancing, which was work done in the previous 10, seems to have gone out of any kind of budget positions in the last 2 years. And so, yeah, I'm just curious where that's sitting.
Mike can probably speak to this better than me, having lived the health system for the last couple of years. I think it does speak to the challenges that were raised on earlier intervention and moving to more community-based services when you still have a very large system that requires significant investment to keep that going and responding to the challenges. Government's attention, necessarily at times goes to keeping the system operating because that's where the priority and the crisis point is. But I don't think it's dropped off priority from our perspective in a Treasury sense at all.
No, and I can guarantee that hasn't dropped off as a priority for the Minister as well. The sustainable health review, I guess, is where you're getting at from a group. But as Lisa touched on, and as we talked about during the presentation, I think that population hit that we sort of had over the last 12 months has put a significant amount of pressure on the tertiary health system, and it's really just a response to making sure that we, I guess, have sufficient funding and staff required to sort of deal with the immediate. That's essentially where that focus has been. But yeah, I can guarantee that it hasn't dropped off the perch in terms of something that we need to continue to focus on and aspire to.
I think the other thing that's heartening is the thinking around how health systems link up with community services, and it might not be visible and particularly big, but those approaches being made to understanding how people get transitioned into housing out of long stay hospital beds. That conversation's even been had at the national level at the disability reform ministers and the health ministers as well, about how we make sure that those service systems from a state perspective are speaking to each other so that we can actually help move people where they're best able to be treated.
And this is where you'll need linked data critically, Michael and Lisa, to demonstrate the cost benefit of doing that, or the liberated capacity in the system.
Yeah, it sort of goes to that earlier conversation too around foundational supports, because we're talking about people that will move in and out of tertiary into that community space. So just having that data at our fingertips is going to be critical.
Kate O'Hara absolutely supports the comments and needing for investment in financial counselling. She says, we see our food bank clients being so transformed in their mental health when they get great, she's put that in capital letters, advice on how to get themselves out of a financial squeeze. How do we make that more visible given how powerful it is as a preventive measure with immediate impact?
In terms of investment into food security service?
Well, into financial counselling, going hand in hand with, so it's more, holistic support as well as because they see people around food insecurity, but they have a whole lot of other issues as well. And financial counselling is one of them.
Yeah, yep. I think that's the critical point. It is investment in services so that those services are available where they're needed, but also the link up of those services so that when a person fronts up, that they're not being diverted elsewhere if their needs are more broad. I know that a lot of effort's been put into that by the sector, particularly in the response to COVID, and in making sure that there's no wrong door approaches when people come to services, that they are treated holistically. It's something that we hear as a priority, and it's something that we hear as something, particularly in the context of cost of living pressures, that financial counselling really goes hand in hand with that.
It's just transformative. It's really transformative, and we need more financial counselling all over, everywhere. Bit of good advice here and there means people won't lose their homes. It's just 1 and 1 goes to 10. It's a fact.
Okay, I've got, Leanne, you want to raise your hand?
Hi, everyone. Yes, thanks. Been reading all the comments and listening to it. Financial counselling is very much a holistic service that's embedded into a lot of referral pathways, and we work closely with the community service sector. And the amount of work to helping people stay in their homes, be able to navigate their way through, financial hardship is so important. And, we're having people have their, houses saved, their debts waived. We work closely with industry as well. We, seek supports outside of government to assist people struggling in financial hardship. We look at policy reform also to ease the financial hardship burden. So it is a sector that we're really worried about because it's stretched thin. It hasn't seen significant funding or increase or growth to retain the workforce. So this is something that we are really worried about going forward with the increasing cost of living, housing insecurity, the rise of scams and all these other things that are impacting people. We also help navigate through utility debt and hardship, and work with those utility providers to get into these programs like the hugs and things like that. So we work closely with these service providers and programs. So I think financial counselling can be a one-stop shop to help navigate the person into the areas that they need to be. So, people have said these comments already, so it's just really disappointing to see that it's not seen as the valued service or profession that it is.
Thanks, Leanne. I've got a question here from David Gilchrist asking the NGHSS indexation continues to fall further behind award wage increase. Shads, when will we get an appropriate model that pays award wages?
That's another one that's a little bit tricky for us to answer in terms of it comes down to government decision making.
Professor, we knew you would ask the question.
Yes. I think I said earlier the NDHSS hasn't been updated in terms of the methodology that's used by government at this point in time. I think the last 2 years worth of indexation have been uplifted above the NGHSS. So government's taken decisions outside of what the rate has recommended for the year and uplifted it for various other factors. And so I do think, as well as taking into account what the March quarter update to WPI says, and how that feeds into what the indexation rate will be for the next financial year, it will also be something that we'll be looking at, and something that potentially government will be looking at is the outcome of the state wage case and also the Fair Work Industrial Award determination in a couple of months' time.
Okay, so on this one, we'd also like to point out that we know you all have been advocating for an increase in indexation. You'll be aware that WACOSS and CEWA have been campaigning very hard for an increase in indexation. And of course, we were disappointed that we didn't see that. I'll let you know that we have been informed by the Treasurer yesterday, because we put this in our media release yesterday, informed WACOSS and a letter back to us in response to our correspondence, that she is committed to a review of this year's indexation rate, subject to the outcomes of the national wage case in June, and any potential indexation gap as a result. So you can have WACOSS's, and I'm sure CEWA's guarantee that we will keep pursuing that, because it is a major issue for us. You all know that, we know that because of indexation, we can't afford to keep up the services that people expect and need. And so we will continue to pursue this. Next question. I've got another comment from Antonella, and she acknowledges that this may be need to take on notice. She says, thanks thanks WACOSS for your dedication in putting all the resources and webinar together so promptly. Are you able to please expand on investment into disability services and support? The investment detail is unclear. What does the 5.1 billion over the next 4 years to support NDIS participants actually mean? Minister Don Punch also said there'd be a number of other programs supported to cover those with disability outside the scope of the NDIS. Do you have any further detail on these programs?
The 5 billion over its full estimates is largely the state's contribution to the NDIS, which is about 1.3 billion per year. So there is with the advent of the NDIS, there is a footprint of state disability services that is committed to, which I think is around actually, I don't know what the footprint is in terms of dollars, but in terms of taking that on notice, we can definitely do that. But the 5 billion is largely the state's NDIS contributions.
The other thing, if I can comment, that is evolving and we're waiting to see. So, you know, there was a National Cabinet decision a little while back around foundational services when they came out with the new agreement. And there's an expectation that we're going to be hearing more about what that actually means sometime soon, because that's the bit where states and territories are meant to be picking up more of the stuff that's being done with young people with a disability and the support that's being provided there. You know, obviously that links into the discussion we had about the child development services and so on, but it's kind of an area where there's still a really critical gap that has a big impact through the life course. So we're kind of waiting to hear what happens next there.
Yeah, one of the things that we'll be looking closely at is the Commonwealth budget on Tuesday.
Yes.
And how this is represented from a financial perspective, or if in fact it is represented from a financial perspective. So, yeah, I guess as we touched on earlier, it's going to be moving at pace over the course of 2024. So,
Okay.
Close eye on it.
And so, Antonella, let's watch this space and engage here. I think as much as fully as we all can. Tina Holton from Child Australia has a comment. Interagency systems efficiency can help to achieve better outcomes in proactively supporting children and families. We're witnessing a concerning rise in significantly stressed families and children within the ECEC sector. Trying to help families into navigating systems to find the support they need is a nightmare. It feels as though they're simply developing a bigger pipeline for child protection. We really need to do better. This budget feels like a missed opportunity. It's a comment. Did you want to respond?
Oh, I think it does pick up on the discussion earlier on earlier intervention measures, and particularly family supports and critically supporting families with a wide range of you know, what's needed to address the challenges they're facing so that kids can stay with family and not end up in the child protection service. But yeah, I take it as a comment that, yeah, it's a missed opportunity in this budget. Yeah.
From a sector point of view, we've been quite interested in the framework that Victoria has put up in recent times, where they've come up with that, you know, early intervention fund that they've been developing and using that to trial some stuff.
Yes.
And I think the idea of having a strategic approach like that, where you've got a central bucket, but you're also then tying to that like a bit of an evaluation framework and some capacity around actually measuring what's having an impact and what works. It's a really good way to do things.
There's lots of lessons to learn from how Victoria's gone about it. So the concept of investing is great. But yeah, do have a look. What we'd advocate is have a look around for, you know, all
approaches.
Well, look at theirs, look at what we learn and make it uniquely West Australian. I've got another question here from Tanya. Oh no, sorry, it's not a question, it's another comment. It's great that we are putting more money into FDV crisis management, but this should come hand in hand with trauma support.
Yep.
That's a comment.
Yep.
Okay, so folks, that's I've run out of questions at the moment. At the risk, sorry. At the risk of not having a free-for-all, are there any urgent questions that people really feel like they need an answer to? Or want to comment? Okay, how much of this is a prelude to the election?
Election promises.
Election promises to come. So it disappeared too quick.
Yeah, well, I guess that's kind of the expectation. You know, there's always the balance in the budget between, you know, kind of doing the business of running government and keeping everything going, and, you know, very clearly they're looking at the next election with what they're doing. They're kind of setting things up again. It's been interesting in our discussions with government. You know, a lot of things they've been saying, we're coming and asking them about something that's kind of like, well, we're not going to be doing anything about that in the next period, but it's the kind of thing that would make a good election initiative. So I suppose from the sector's point of view at the moment, now's kind of a critical time, particularly because of the pattern that we've seen, you know, with recent terms of government, where they're very much in the model of we lock in things as an election commitment. Then if you come and ask us something, it's kind of, oh, well, no, we're just committed and we've just got funding to deliver the election commitments. So it probably you need to be bending politicians' arms at the moment, going to them with good ideas and putting them in a way that looks attractive to them politically. So
got a question up here. I think it's Cal 3483. Your hand is up.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Sorry, I've also just posted in the chat. Sorry, I didn't put my name down there. It's Alison from the City of Wanneroo.
Right.
We're interested to know, with the increase in baseline funding to homelessness services in particular, but also as funding's been increased across various services, what is the state doing to ensure equitable access of services in different geographies? We have a underservicing in many areas in Perth's northern suburbs, particularly the further north that you go.
Yeah, I think in terms of the breadth and distribution of the services and where the funding goes and where we're purchasing services, that's probably more for the commissioning agency, which in this case is Department of Communities. I guess I could say that the state commissioning strategy does talk to place-based services and ensuring that, you know, the services that are provided are responsive to the needs of those communities and regions across Western Australia. But yeah, I think that's a question for the department.
It's the next level down that we don't necessarily all are probably best placed to be investing in, unfortunately. Yeah.
I guess it does go back to that discussion that we're having earlier around kind of, you know, population growth and impacts, because that's been one of the regions that's been the fastest growing. There's so many new developments going out there, you know, WACOSS area and so on.
Yeah.
That there's a real challenge for social infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure to keep up.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we've seen thanks for that comment. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our speakers, Michael, Lisa, Chris and Emily, for their time today and their excellent contributions to the forum. Also, I want to do a really big shout out to all the staff of WACOSS and the YACWA contributions last night into developing our fact sheets and pulling this whole show together today. Everybody works extremely hard in very short time frames. And and of course, SRWA has made a fantastic contribution as well to the fact sheets and also getting their head around the budget. So thank you very much, and thank you all for attending and your really good questions. Thank you. We'll see you again when we do it all again next year.
Thanks,
in
everyone.
August next year.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.